Hi you guys, what's up? Welcome back to another one of my videos. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to make a bar chart, and we're going to be populating the bar chart using the SQLite database. So what you can see is we've got a edit text where we can put in our data, save button to save the data to the database, and then we're going to grab the data from the database and populate our bar chart. If that's something you're interested in, stick around and I'll show you how to make that from scratch. Okay, let's get going. Okay, so we've got our simple Hello World app here. First thing we need to do is open our Grendel and go to the app or the module app file, and we need to add in some dependencies and some repertories. So for the repertories, we simply add as so, and then for the dependencies, we're going with the MPAndroidChart. As always, look out for the latest version of the MPAndroidChart to make sure you've got the latest version available to you, and press sync. Okay, so now that's set up, we can very quickly set up our activity main in the XML. So I'm just going to copy and paste this from my example for the purposes of saving time. But what I've done is I'll take you through each step. So we've got our bar chart at the top here. I've just put a top margin of 100 dp at the top, so we've got room for our edit text and our save button. And I've given it the ID of bar chart. Below this, I've got the button, which is just a simple save or clicking button. And then we've got an edit text, very simply named edit text and button respectively. So obviously I said we're going to be doing this through saving data to an SQLite database. So what we'll do is we'll get our SQLite database set up, and then we'll wire everything up in our main activity. So I want you to go to your main activity or your main package, right click and make a new package which we're going to call data. In the data package, we're going to have two new Java classes. We're going to have one which is going to be our database constants. This is going to hold all of the constants which we're going to use in our database. So for example, our column IDs and our database name, our database version, for example. Other than that, we actually want the database itself. This is an SQLite database. Okay, cool. So let's define some constants first. So we go public static final string, and we want the database name. This can be called anything you like. I'm just going to call it a bar chart. And you do the same for the database version, except for the version is going to be of an integer type. And we're going to call this version 1. If you want to go through the versions, you obviously just change this 1 up to 2, up to 3, up to 4 as you change versions. So the next thing we obviously want to know is the table name. So when we're doing a database, we're obviously generating a table, and we've got to give this table an ID. So we'll give it a table name, and I'm just going to call this bar chart table. Second, we're going to want some information as to what we're saving into our table. So I'd always start with putting in a key ID for any of the rows in which we're going to populate the database with, just to give a unique ID for each column or each row. And then we want the actual data in which we're going to display in our bar chart. So in this case, I'm going to use the date as the x-axis. So I can call this date, and we're just going to call this date. And as the y-axis, we're just using a number, although you can use whatever you like. So I'm just going to call this y-axis. It's going to be equal to y-axis. Okay, so that's all our constants set up. What we can do now is go onto our database and get everything implemented into our database. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to extend SQLite Open Helper. This is going to come up with an error to start with, so we have to implement a few methods. You can either go Alt-Enter, or you can come on to this red light bulb here and go to Implement Methods. We want both of these, and then we also want the super matching method, the constructor matching super. So once you've got all that, we just need to tidy this up a bit. We can get rid of the nullable, and the only thing we want here is the context. So we can get rid of everything else. We don't need to name these here, as we've just made them into our constants Java class. So we can simply say constants dot database name. What we want next, the factory is null, and the version, again, we define this in our constants dot database version. In our onCreate, what we need to do is actually create the table itself. So here we just say string, and we give the table a name. So we're going to call it bar chart table. And we're going to enter the command create table. Make sure you leave spaces where you need spaces. And now we need to actually define each of the columns in our database table. We can again use the constants which we did before. So obviously the first thing we want to do is create the table name. You go bracket space comma plus constants dot key ID. And what type is this going to be? It's going to be of an integer. So we say integer. It's going to be a primary key which auto increments. Make sure you put a comma at the end and a space before moving on to the next column. Constants, we've got the date. And this is going to be of type string. So we've also got constants dot y-axis, which is again going to be of type string. We're ending here, so we're going to end with a comma, a semicolon inside the quotation marks, and we also have to put semicolon outside the quotation marks too. Lastly, we just need to make sure we create the database table itself. So we just say db.execute, and we defined our table here as the bar chart table, and that's what we're going to make. Perfect. In terms of our upgrade, we don't really need to do much here, but we can just simply put in very quickly db.execute, and we can say drop table if exists space. That's what we're dropping. We have to put in constants dot the table in which we're interested in. And then once the table is dropped, we need to replace it with a new table. Okay, good. Okay, so in our database, we're basically doing two different things. The first thing we're going to be doing is saving data to the database. Is when we press our save button and we save whatever number is in our edit text. The second thing we're going to be doing is going to be querying the data and grabbing it to fill the bar charts. So we're going to make two methods here and say public void. I'm going to call this save data. And we're saving two different data types. We're going to save a string, which we're going to call the x value, and we're going to save a string, which is going to be called the y value. So here we say SQLite database. I'm going to give it the abbreviation DB equals this dot get writable database, because we're writing to the database. Here we're going to put in constant values. Call this values equals new constant values. So here we just simply define the values in which we're saving. So values dot put, and we're going to save the date. So we say constants dot date. And what's that going to be equal to? The date is going to be equal to our x-axis, so the value of x. For our y values, we simply put in the same thing, but here we're not interested in the date, we're interested in what we define as our y value. And then we simply have to insert this into our database. So we say database.insert. We set it into the table name, so constants.table name, and we put in the values. So when we get to our MainActivity method, we're going to implement this method, and we're going to specify what the x is and what the y is, and then the database is going to save the x value into the date column and the y value into the y-axis column. The next thing we need to do is set up our queries. So here we say public, and it's going to be an array list. It's going to be of type string. And this is going to be, first we will do one for the x-axis and then one for the y-axis. So here we're going to call this query x data. Okay, so we're going to say SQLite database, DB for short, is going to be equal to this dot get writable. The array list, which is going to be of type string, is going to be called x data. It's going to be a new array list of type string. Okay. Next, we need to actually define our query. So we say string dot, we'll call it a query, and we're going to say that we want to select, we say constants dot date. We want to select the date from our database. Select date from, make sure you keep the spaces, constants dot table name. And we want to make sure that we group them by the table, by the date. So we want all the data from one date to be grouped together. So we say space group by, and we want to group by the date. So this query is defining what we're actually doing. We're selecting the date, which we've saved here, from our table, which we've made up here. And our condition is that if the dates are the same, we add the y values into the same bar. So here, we next need a cursor to look through our database. So we say cursor, which we'll just call cursor, equals the database raw query, and we're going to put in the query in which we just defined, and we have no selection rules. Next, we have to put a for loop in to define what we want the cursor to do. So from the cursor, move to first. So when the cursor is not last, cursor move to next. which spans basically everything the cursor can do. We're going to say xdata dot add, and what we're adding, we're going to add the cursor dot get the string, and we want the first column index. So this is basically saying look for the first index of the cursor all the way up to the last and add and query all the data. After we've used the cursor, we need to close it. And what do we want to return? We want to return our X data. That all looks good. Next thing we need to do is do the same thing, but for our Y value. So for simplicity here, I'm just going to copy and paste. Going to change query X to query Y. I'm going to change X data to Y data. We're going to return the Y data here as well. But obviously we want our query to be different. We don't want to be grabbing the date as the y-axis. So we're going to change this. So what I think we'll do here is we're going to select a sum. So all of the inputs you put in one date will be summed together. So we can say select the sum of the y-axis brackets from where we're getting the data from. Obviously we're getting it from the database table, and we want to put in a few conditions here as well. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say we want to make sure that when it looks for data, that it only selects the valid data. So we can say where space plus constant dot y-axis plus is not null. That means if for whatever reason, if the y-axis doesn't have anything to grab, it won't come up with an error, it won't grab anything. The y-axis has to be valid, it has to be not null for it to be counted. And again, we want to group by the date. So all the y-axes of the same date are put together. Okay. So let's have a look how that's looking. Okay, everything there looks good. Okay, so that's our constants sorted. That's our database sorted. We've also got our main activity XML sorted. So let's wire everything up in our main activity. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do in our main activity is just implement everything. So we're going to say private.bar chart, and we're just going to call this bar chart. We've also got a button, which I'm going to hopefully call button, not butter, button. We've also got an edit text, which I'm going to call edit text. And we have the database itself. So to get the database, what we have to do is we have to say we have to call it the database and make sure we import it. So you can see it comes up on here, and we've imported the class which we've created here. And I'm just going to call that DB for database. So anything else I want to include here is a date, because the x-axis here is going to be of type date. I'm going to use system.current time millis to get the current date. Okay, that's excellent. So now in our onCreate, what we need to do is we need to implement all these. So we say bar chart equals type bar chart, find view by ID, r.id bar chart, and we do the same with the button and the edit text. Okay, cool. So I'm going to use an Onclicklistener for our button to set everything up. So we say button.setOnclicklistener, new Onclicklistener. So in our Onclicklistener, we're going to implement our save to database method. So we'll make that down here. So we say public void save to database. So we're going to say database equals new database with the context of this. So in the save to database method, we need to define our x value and we need to define our y value. So first, if I make a string called the x value, here we want it to be a date. So the best way to do this, I found, is to say simple date format SDF is equal to new simple date format, and in the brackets you can put in the pattern of the date in which you'd like the data to display. So I prefer it to be of pattern day and month. And then for our date, the x value, we say format SDF dot format of type date. So what this is saying, let's just right click this and add a suppress link. So remember at the top we defined date using our current time millis with our system. So it's basically getting the current date and it's displaying it using the date format of date, day, and month. Next we move on to our y value. And this is going to be simply the edit text. So it's just going to be edit text dot get text dot string. Simple as that. Next, we want to implement our method which we created in our database. This is going to be the save data method. We're saving data to the database. So here we say db dot save data, and here we just define our x val and our y value. So the x val is what we defined here, and our y value is what we defined here. Perfect. So after this is done, we just need to close the database and everything is good. Okay, so we want this to be called every time we press the save button, so we call this method inside the Onclicklistener. The next thing we need to do is make a method to create the data for our graph, our bar chart. So we say public void add data to graph. So here we say db equals new database this. So final array list. This is going to be initially of type bar entry. We're going to call it yvals, and it's going to be a new array list. That's going to be of type bar entry. Next, we want a final array list, which is going to be the y data. That's going to be a new array list, type string. This is where we add the data to our bar chart. So we say for I equals 0 to I is less than db dot query the y data dot size to I plus plus. So what we're going to say is bar entry equals new bar entry. This is going to be new bar entry, and we're going to grab the data from our y data query. We're going to get the position, which is I. We have to wrap it in a float because it is a string with a y value dot add, and we're going to add the new bar entry. Next, we do a similar sort of thing for the x-axis. So we're going to copy both of these, but we don't want the x-axis to be a bar entry, we want it to be a string. We're going to call this x and call this x, and we want this to be string. So that's all looking good. We obviously want, oh, I know what was going on. This isn't an array list, of course it isn't. It's the data which we're querying. At the bottom here, similarly, we don't want an array list, we want the x-axis data. Okay, cool. We just need to do another for loop. So again, we say int I equals 0 up to I is less than db dot query. That's the y, so the x, sorry, dot size I plus plus. And what we're doing, we're getting the x value, and we're adding the x data at the correct position. So to get the data actually displaying in the bar chart, we say bar data set. We're going to call this data set equals new bar data set, and we're going to define what we want to display, which is our y values. In terms of the string label, I'm just going to call this example graph. The next thing we want to do is add in our y data. So we can say bar data, capital B, we'll call this data, and that's equal to new bar data. And here we have to define exactly what our bar data is going to be. So we can say the array list, which is going to be I bar data set, which we can say data sets, do this, call this data set 1 equals new array list. We can say database dataset 1 dot add, and we're going to add the data set we defined here. Can get very confusing, dataset 1, dataset. Stick with me. What we're going to do is add this to our bar data, and we pretty much are ready to go now. The most important things you want to do is you want to go bar chart dot get x-axis dot set value formatter new index value formatter, and you want this to be the value of the y values. So this is grabbing the y values from your database, i.e. the dates. Sorry, I keep saying y, don't I? X values. It keeps grabbing the x values, which is in this case the date, and putting the label underneath your y-axis. The last thing we want to do is actually set the data. The last thing we need to do is add the add to graph method to our onCreate. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add it to our save database file as well. So when the data is saved, it also would refresh the graph, but we also perhaps want the graph to show previous data without having to add new data, for example. So what I'm going to do is add it up here as well. So it will generate any previous graph on create, and it would also generate a graph when we add new data. Okay, so before we test this thing out, just to let you know, I've added a few extra bits just to make the data graph look a little bit more presentable. So I've just changed some of the viewpoints of the x-axis and the right axis and made the data bars fit a certain amount, etc., etc. And just to clarify, the other things I've added is in the save to database method, I've added barchart.invalidate below the add data to graph method. And I've also added the barchart.invalidate to the onCreate method as well. So if we run this, we should get a good graph which sums up our y-axis values and arranges those via the date. So let's see how it works out. Okay, so if we say 5 and we press save, then we get 5 on the 1st of July, which is today's date. If I press now, change this to 25, remember we're getting the sum of all the data, so this should now go up to 30, which it has. Again, we can double check this again, press 70, and let's see it jump up to a sum of 100. Perfect. So that's it, getting data from the SQLite database and displaying it into a bar chart. When you come back tomorrow and you use this graph, a new bar would be fitted to the right with tomorrow's date on it. Okay, hope you found the tutorial enjoyable and helpful. If you did, please subscribe and leave this a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. Okay, cheers, take it easy.